Well, thank you very much. It's a great joy to be here and a privilege to be at the University of Texas, and I greet you all. Appreciate you coming out on that. And if you consider this a cold day, I just want to say, evidently, not only is all politics local, as Tip O'Neill said, evidently all meteorology is as well. Because this is not cold, but nonetheless colder than perhaps you were expecting. Rarely do I have to lower a microphone, as I do in this case. It is a great honor to be here. Professor Inboden's invitation is one I received most graciously and appreciate. I'm proud to be here at the William Clements Center and to know the work of this center in terms of history and strategy and statecraft. It's an honor to speak in the context of the Lyndon Johnson School. As a boy, born in 1959, I was born in the waning years of the Eisenhower administration. I remember nothing of the Kennedy administration, but the President of the United States, in terms of my dawning political awareness, was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And coming through the television, he loomed large in my life. And he continues to do so. I just want to share one anecdote about President Johnson. And I do this in the danger of sharing in intimacy, but with actually the permission of Dr. Billy Graham. The Billy Graham School of Missions, Evangelism, and Ministry is on our campus. It's one of the graduate schools at Southern Seminary. He's been a dear friend. I've chaired one of his crusades. And we have a new dean of that school, and I wanted to introduce him to Dr. Graham. And so we made the pilgrimage to his home in North Carolina. And he is in his 10th decade of life, and still an absolutely remarkable person, as he always has been. And as someone at that stage of life, he is actually far more conversant about things in the past. And when I didn't ask him questions about presidents, but they came up, and the president he spoke about more than any other was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And he took me and he pointed to two rocking chairs on the porch of the house that LBJ had given him after a visit to the home, and they're still there. And he showed me a picture of them, and it's just amazing how these people continue to have a living legacy beyond what you might even imagine. And I imagine that Lyndon Baines Johnson could imagine his name being invoked in many circles. But would he know that it would be invoked in a conversation among two Baptist preachers on the top of a mountain in North Carolina with two rocking chairs as witnesses? I'm not sure. I'm very glad to be here at the University of Texas, one of the world's great universities. I speak as a theologian with an interest in public policy and international relations. I do speak as a theologian, not as an expert in those other fields, but as a theologian who believes that these endeavors and the history of both of these noble human endeavors is of vital importance, and at the intersection of theology and public life, of religion and public policy. I want to argue, indeed, in the moments I have, for the inescapable and inherently theological nature of both endeavors. And I realize there's some controversy in that, but that's frankly why I'm here. It is to argue that these remain rather essentially theological in character, even in the hands of those who do not intend for them to be so, or to be such. I believe that both of these endeavors, public policy and international relations, are essential to human flourishing and thus of importance to us all. The title of my address is Moral Man and Immoral Foreign Policy, the Ironies of International Relations. And thus I betray my intention and focus. Those of you who are aware of Christian realism and of Reinhold Niebuhr, that towering public intellectual of the 20th century, theologian at Union Theological Seminary, had such an impact on the thinking of American public life in the level of both the elites and what might be called middlebrow culture from the 1920s through the 1970s. His great work, Moral Man and Immoral Society, is echoed in the title of my talk on Moral Man and Immoral Foreign Policy. Furthermore, Niebuhr's concept of irony in history and in human experience is one to which I intend to turn, but I will actually return to Niebuhr in just a moment. But I want first to make a claim and then an acknowledgement. And the claim is quite straightforward, and that is that American foreign policy, as a subset of the total human endeavor of international relations, demonstrates the essentially theological character of the enterprise. And it does so in ways that I think even those of us who are aware of certain patterns are commonly surprised when we see the whole. And I want to focus mostly on the 20th century, but going back at least to the late 19th century into the dawn of the 20th century, the Spanish-American War There you had the American government, the American president, declared that a purpose of the war was the Christianization of the heathen, in particular in the Philippines. And it seems almost impossible to us now that in the span of slightly over a century, we can look backwards and see such a statement. But I'm far more interested actually in the 20th century, in what would be considered a century of the most rapid and pervasive secularization of American public life, especially in the elites. And then you look back to the dawn of the 20th century, you look back to that great war that is now so much a focus of our historical reflection because of the anniversary of 1914 and its centenary. And you look back to Woodrow Wilson and his internationalism, and to what Andrew Preston would call the idealistic synthesis that took place in the early decades. It was a synthesis of what? Well, at least in part, it was a synthesis of theology and foreign policy. If you take theology out of the issue of, or the understanding of Woodrow Wilson, you don't have Woodrow Wilson. You also don't have the liberal internationalism that Wilson symbolized and helped to pioneer. And as so many others have documented, this was the first liberal internationalism in terms of American public life. Where did it come from? It didn't come from a secular source. And as a matter of fact, it didn't come from just an isolated theological stream. It came from the dominant theological tenor of American Protestantism at the dawn of the 20th century. Wilson, in his declaration of war on April the 2nd, 1917, when he was speaking to Congress, ended his call for Congress to declare war with echoes of Martin Luther standing at the Diet of Worms, and which was exactly then 400 years previous. Now, you can see 500 years of Luther's famous stand coming before us. You'll remember that Luther's statement at the Diet of Worms, as he concluded his statement, was, "Here I stand, I can do none other, God help me." Concluding his address, calling for war, Woodrow Wilson, speaking of America, said, "God helping her, she can do none other." Then you had some interesting things going on just in terms of American foreign policy and public life in the period that included the end of World War I and the interwar years in America. But going back to the beginnings of World War I, in Europe there was a tremendous theological foment having to do with the fact that the war aims of Germany brought to an end, and then the actual carnage of World War I brought to an end the golden era of theological liberalism in Europe, and in particular in Germany, and actually spawned a theological reaction which became known as neo-orthodoxy. Karl Barth very famously said that what opened his eyes to the collapse of the liberal experiment was the Bethmann-Hollweg Declaration signed by the faculty of German universities. And as Barth said, it was inconceivable to him that the very professors who were teaching the gospel of peace would so quickly sign a declaration, a militaristic declaration of sheer nationalism on behalf of the German government. And so even as Barth's commentary on Romans became, as was later described, the bomb that exploded in the playground of the theologians, it was the Bethmann-Hollweg Declaration that was the bomb that exploded Protestant liberalism. And that was in Germany. And interestingly enough, but not perhaps surprising, in the United States, theological liberalism was at its height after World War I, because America and Europe, America and Germany in particular, had almost equal and opposite responses theologically to the war. It was the death of kind of post-millennial human optimism to which the liberal experiment was tied in Germany, but it was the birth of America as a world power and of American influence on the world scene. And so at the very time you had theological liberalism collapsing in Germany and neo-orthodoxy in ascendancy, you also had in the United States Harry Emerson Fosdick and Protestant liberalism increasing in influence. But that's an interesting point, because the great issue of World War I, theologically, for the American elites, was whether pacifism could be abandoned in terms of joining and giving public support to the war effort. And someone like Harry Emerson Fosdick actually represents someone who did make that shift, only to have the experience of World War I convince him that he was wrong to have made that shift and to have actually taken a pacifist position, even in light of World War II. But what happened in the United States in terms of the engagement of theology in public life was that there emerged also in the United States a form of neo-orthodoxy. And that neo-orthodoxy was found more than anything else in Reinhold Niebuhr. By the way, the German influence was here, and so at the elites you had you had an open embrace of German higher critical methods of biblical interpretation and German idealistic philosophy and all these things that came over the elites, but you also had, at the level of American evangelicals, an understanding that thus Germany was the source of all of this evil, coming not only in terms of its militarism, but coming also in terms of its theological liberalism. So you had someone like Billy Sunday who said during the First World War about theological liberalism, not militarism, the famous evangelist said, quote, "If you turn hell upside down, you will find made in Germany stamped on the bottom." The shift from pacifism to war is one that is certainly worthy of our attention, and Woodrow Wilson stands at the very center of that in terms of public influence and not only constitutional responsibility. But at the end of the war, when you take Wilson's 14 points and his model of a new internationalism, much to be said about this, of course, in terms of its successes and its massive failures. But the point is that Wilson's internationalism was essentially a Christian internationalism and was specifically a Presbyterian internationalism. In terms of his trains of thought, here you have the son, grandson, and nephew of Southern Presbyterian ministers whose rather liberal Protestantism was nonetheless culturally and ideologically situated in such a way that his internationalism was as much rooted in his understanding of mainline Protestant Christian missions as it was in anything else. Wilson himself represents just as one singular individual the inherently theological nature of American foreign policy, certainly in the early 20th century. And then you have someone like David Houston, a close observer of Wilson, of course, who wrote in his memoir, 8 Years with Wilson's Cabinet, he wrote that Wilson's, quote, "religious concerns were primarily moral, not theological in character. The Christian life was merely the task of acting out God's certain commands in a world of good and evil," end quote. And, you know, even though this was a liberal Protestantism, this was not Woodrow Wilson, the evangelist for the supernatural in terms of God's current intervention in human affairs and in his defense of the verities of the historic Christian religion. But this is Wilson, the liberal Protestant, who is nonetheless as Protestant as he was liberal, and whose worldview was deeply steeped in what became an almost Manichaean understanding of good and evil that was more theological and than anything else, and essentially theological in terms of that understanding. By the way, that explains why someone like David Lloyd George referred to Wilson dismissively as that missionary without appreciating him, and the French Prime Minister even far more dismissive. Wilson was to him inconceivable. Well, then just to fast forward, you have Herbert Hoover's Quaker humanitarianism. And again, Herbert Hoover is one of the most neglected figures in American public and intellectual life, I think. But when you look at Hoover, he is even more Quaker, if anything, than Wilson was Presbyterian. And Hoover's Quaker humanitarianism, which, by the way, ran right into conflict with the Roosevelt administration over the question of feeding those who were Nazi-occupied lands. It was inconceivable to Hoover that one would not feed people under any circumstance or send food. And, of course, that became a great problem for the early Roosevelt administration. But let's look at Roosevelt. Here you have a liberal Episcopalian. But again, people remember the liberal, they forget the Episcopalian. They forget that he was a vestryman. And they forget just how essentially Christian and theological in terms of even liberal Protestantism his worldview was. Francis Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, once said to Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, Franklin is just essentially a very simple Christian. And Eleanor Roosevelt responded, yes, a very simple Christian. But nonetheless, that was his theological impulse. Some really interesting material in the Roosevelt archives in terms of, for instance, his engagement with the Soviet Union, with Stalin and with Stalin's acolytes. Roosevelt was actually far more influential in protecting religious liberty than we might imagine. Not only did he put it in the famous Four Freedoms Address, and not only did he defend it publicly, as the archives demonstrate, in very effective ways, at least within the context of the politics of the day and the politics of the possible. He was very intent on arguing, and there's actually some very interesting material in which he's arguing with Soviet leaders about theism, and arguing that at the end of the day, when they die, there will be theists again. They will know when they face their death that there is succor only in theism. And so you have the simple Christian, the liberal Episcopalian, the vestryman, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And when you look, again, at his speeches, not just his fireside chats, not just at his speeches, but when you look at the archival material, it's drenched in theology. You cannot take the theological material out. And I'm not even sure the extent to which Roosevelt, compared to Wilson, understood just how theological his arguments were. Francis Perkins may have been right, and Eleanor Roosevelt may have been even more right. Maybe he was a very simple Christian, but nonetheless, that comes through. And then you have, as a Baptist, I have to mention Harry Truman the Baptist. How did this engage Truman's statecraft? I think probably few examples, but one very central example, and that was the recognition of Israel in 1948. As the archives of the Truman administration demonstrate, Truman was convinced to recognize Israel largely on the basis of theological arguments. Zionists, of course, have been influential, and we're trying to get to him. But at the end of the day, as is now rather well documented, Truman was convinced on the basis of the fact that it was theologically right and necessary, brave and courageous though it was, to recognize Israel as a nation in 1948. Eisenhower. What do you do with Eisenhower? Again, I was born in the last years of the Eisenhower administration, and I find fascination with Eisenhower. It's hard to find a lot of material on some of this until you realize Eisenhower is the only president of the United States who was baptized as president. We've had 45 presidencies and 44 men have been president. Only one of them was baptized as he was living in the White House. That was Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower had a very utilitarian understanding of both theology and faith. I can't read his heart, just read his statements. And his most famous statement had to do with the dedication of the headquarters of what became the National Council of Churches in Manhattan, there on Riverside Drive up there, with the Riverside Church and Union Theological Seminary right there, and that very important, right almost across from Grant's tomb. In dedicating it, the President of the United States accepted the invitation, and then he said that every nation must have a faith, and then said effectively, to paraphrase him, I don't care what faith it is. But there has to be, the nation has to be held together by a religious faith. In terms of the archival material and all the rest, as we're guided by those who spend a lot of time on it, it's hard to find a lot of explicitly theological arguments in Eisenhower. Frankly, it's hard to find a lot of explicitly anything arguments in Eisenhower. In other words, if you're looking for an ideological or worldview engagement, because his material and his statecraft was rather straightforwardly more military, which is not a surprise. And yet, in the background to Eisenhower was a structure of political and social plausibility, which was made possible in terms of the synthesis of what Will Herberg referred to in his famous book, Protestant Catholic Jew. There is a basically inherently religious character to the American experiment, and there are three major brand names, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And if you are involved in any of those three, to any extent, you're a part of this project. Eisenhower was very suspicious of any kind of atheism and considered agnosticism, insofar as we can tell, as kind of a cowardly position. But Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, they were all a part of this grand experiment. And then, of course, the background of this is the Cold War. And one of the things we see in retrospect is just how theological American public statements were in terms of the Cold War, and just how theological was the American response. I mean, in terms of the coinage and the Pledge of Allegiance, the under God language was added as a response to godless communism. And let's just point out that if you're responding to godless communism, you're responding with some kind of theological argument. It may be vague, it may be almost innocuous, but it's nonetheless an inherently theological argument. And you have all these theologically informed people in the background of this, including the Dulles brothers, especially John Foster Dulles. It's hard to imagine talking about statecraft during the Cold War without Dulles. And here you have Dulles, another Presbyterian. Presbyterians show up here a lot. And you have this not accidental or incidental Presbyterian. I mean, if you're writing the history of American Presbyterianism in the 20th century, you're going to be writing a lot about John Foster Dulles in terms of his activities within the Presbyterian Church and the Northern Presbyterian denomination and Presbyterian institutions. And so when you're talking about the Cold War, just using John Foster Dulles as an example, he is using theological arguments, and even more than that, I would argue. His arguments only make sense within a basically theological worldview, in which his own personal biography is a sufficient explanation. By the way, one of the very good experiences in my life was spending 2 days sitting next to Avery Cardinal Dulles, which, by the way, just to say that is to say something happened in this Presbyterian story during a series of meetings in a think tank in New York some years ago. And the late Cardinal was one of the most engaging human beings I've ever had the opportunity to talk to. And that made me even want to understand him more. I mean, how in the world do you get a Jesuit cardinal from the son of the United States Secretary of State? Of course, he was the son, and there were 2 United States Secretaries of State behind him in the Dulles line, and Lansing, his maternal grandfather. And you look at this and you realize this is really, really strange. And then you realize just how theological that the life of that family was, even in terms of the citation of the name of the Secretary of State's son as a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. But that leads us to John F. Kennedy. And you can't come to John F. Kennedy without going through John Courtney Murray and the great theological transformation that took place within American Catholicism during the Cold War at the end of World War II, where American Catholicism became a far more politically engaged American worldview, made possible by John Courtney Murray, who plays a similar role actually to that of Reinhold Niebuhr in American Protestantism. But Murray came up with the intellectual framework that allowed Catholicism to be situated within pluralism and within an American constitutional order. And John F. Kennedy's moralism, I would argue that the closer we look at Kennedy, the more we see he was more or less personally secular. He was nonetheless operationally Catholic in some very important ways. And of course, with the greatest insight into his personal beliefs is found in his address to the Houston Baptist Pastors Conference in 1960, where he said that his actual faith was a matter of private concern, which is of interest only to him as an individual and to his creator. But nonetheless, when you look at his rather brief statecraft and his continuation of the Cold War, you find that continuing moral judgment that is essentially theological in terms of its character, a moral judgment about the Soviet Union and its aims and the worldview that produced those aims. Then you have the interregnum with Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford, more or less a continuation of the same. Interesting stuff going on there too. Not so much of direct interest to my argument here, because those 3 represented something of a continuation of a basic Cold War mentality that came before. Not one of the 3 of them articulated in terms of statecraft anything that was basically an innovation from a theological viewpoint. But then arrives Jimmy Carter in the year of the evangelical in 1976, and the Southern Baptist Sunday school teaching peanut farmer from Georgia. And with Jimmy Carter, you have kind of a return to a Wilsonian internationalism, but it's clearly rooted in his sense of a Christian worldview, and in a model of internationalism that is based upon his own Christian faith. I mean, here you have, it's kind of a return to McKinley in one sense, was talking about Christianizing the heathen. Here you have, in his own memoirs, Jimmy Carter talking about his attempts to personally convert Leonid Brezhnev to the Christian faith. And you look back at it now, that's not ancient history, but it seems almost inconceivable to the American secular mind that you would have an elected American president who takes a Bible to the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR in hopes of converting him. And that wasn't the only place. He tried to convert many others in terms of world leaders. And you look at this, I mean, he's still Jimmy Carter, the Sunday school teacher. And by the way, even though it's Ronald Reagan who is rightly credited or blamed, depending on the one who's speaking, for the idea of the Soviet Union as the evil empire, if you look at the actual speeches of Jimmy Carter, there's a very similar kind of Manichaean understanding that is very present there. And just to think of the Olympics in 1980, and you look at the speeches of Jimmy Carter, there's a lot of theological content, certainly in the background of the judgments he's making about the Soviet Union. And then Ronald Reagan. The kind of a merger in terms of his worldview of revivalism and Manichaeanism. And just to kind of place myself in 1976, as a 16-year-old, I was a very avid worker in the Ronald Reagan political campaign, the presidential campaign, the Crusade of 1976. And that's where a lot of my own political worldview was really shaped and formed. And I had the honor of meeting the governor. And I'm not sure how politically thoughtful I was at the time. I was enormously captivated And it was a campaign of ideas, and again, those ideas they were certainly rooted in certain economic understandings and a very basic understanding of freedom. But to understand Ronald Reagan, and even more now that we have access to so many of his handwritten notes and to his diaries and all the rest, it is clear that Reagan's understanding of statecraft was inherently theological, and irreducibly so. And then you talk about the 1980s, it's impossible to talk about this without adding to the conversation Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Pope John Paul II, in terms of an essentially theological front against the Soviet Union, and a theological reading of history with the collapse of the Soviet Union. George H.W. Bush, somewhat a return, I think, in terms of public political and theological engagement to FDR, not just because they were both Episcopalians, but because they both had a kind of prototypically Episcopalian understanding of statecraft. And then with Bill Clinton, kind of a return to JFK. In terms of his understanding. And then George W. Bush, kind of returned in his own way to Wilson in terms of internationalism. And then just to end this in terms of trying to make the argument about the pervasiveness of theology in statecraft, you had Barack Obama. And for this, I'll just go back to last week. When President Obama spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast, and admittedly he was speaking to the National Prayer Breakfast, but he was speaking to the world in the context of the National Prayer Breakfast, and gave an address in which he more boldly than ever before and explicitly than ever before addressed the issue of human rights as related to religious liberty. In that statement, the President of the United States very clearly grounded the understanding of religious liberty in the Imago Dei, explicitly citing the fact that this is rooted in the fact that every single human being is made in the image of God. So, just speaking of the inherently theological nature of statecraft, I would just affirm that when you're talking about human rights and human dignity, you're talking theology. When you're talking about the reality of moral evil and the malevolent aggression that is so often in the world and must be addressed, you're talking theology. And there's always, thirdly, what is often missed, an eschatological backdrop to the conversation about foreign policy, whether that eschatological background is nuclear holocaust or population explosion or climate change or economic collapse. It is the language, essentially, which is made possible by Christian eschatology. So that's my claim. And you'll understand that the main point I'm trying to make is that you can't talk about foreign policy without constant, pervasive reference to theology. But then I want to make an acknowledgement. And that is that the world has changed since William McKinley and Woodrow Wilson and FDR, and for that matter, since Kennedy and Nixon and Johnson. I want to acknowledge that secularism is a reality, and furthermore, that the more important issue is not secularism, but secularization. The secularization of the global scene, especially in terms of the advanced economies in Europe, and now much of North America, and increasingly in the United States, has changed the terms of public conversation, of public reference, and the plausibility structures of the entire society. It's done so subtly, and this is often over-argued. That's where someone like Peter Berger at Boston University is so helpful, in which he points out that secularization is not an even process. And as he says, as a matter of fact, secularization theory, he said, failed generally to explain the fact that Western societies, traditional secularization theory had claimed, would grow inherently secular and very quickly with modern technology, the rationalization of processes and all the rest. And it didn't happen, and as he said, it didn't happen except where it did. Secularization theory failed everywhere except Europe and the American college and university campus, just in terms of his analysis. And of course, that's somewhat dated because it is becoming increasingly clear that secularization is affecting the larger American public. There again, it's not evenly distributed, more heavily weighted towards urban areas, and especially heavily weighted towards younger people, the demographic of the millennials. For instance, the latest Pew study, 1 out of 5 Americans is a nun, NES. In terms of the nuns on radio, I mentioned that the fastest growing category in America of religion was nuns. I quickly realized you got to spell that, NES. It's 1 out of 5 Americans, according to Pew, and that Pew data is pretty invincible in terms of looking at it, but it's 1 out of 3 ages 29 and younger. By the way, speaking of Peter Berger on this, you may remember that Peter Berger did this massive longitudinal study of the various religiosity of the cultures of the world, and he did it by nation states. At the end of this, his team of researchers came back and they discovered that the most religious nation on earth is India, just measured by sheer religious activity, devotion, all the markers that the sociologists put in place, and the least was Sweden. And so the question came at the press conference to Peter Berger, then what is the United States? And he said the United States is a nation of Indians ruled over by an elite of Swedes. There's truth in that, of course, but you also recognize that it is no longer confined to the elites. And I think as an evangelical theologian, I need as often as I can to affirm that and acknowledge the fact that I believe that secularization is now in the United States on a path that is seen in retrospect only to be delayed from the experience of Northern and Western Europe. We're not an exception, we're just a delayed case. And I think theologically we have to take that very much into account. So looking at that, we recognize that this American exceptionalism can be overclaimed, and yet there's still a difference even now in terms of American foreign policy. Or just to go back to when Tony Blair was prime minister. And you'll recall that when George W. Bush was president, and I don't recall exactly what the president had said, but Tony Blair, I do know this. You remember that President Bush, George W. Bush, as some presidents before him had done occasionally, President George W. Bush ended almost every one of his major speeches with the words, "And God bless the United States of America." And so, oddly enough, the British Prime Minister had ended very awkwardly a couple of addresses with something kind of similar. And he was intending to say at the end of an address, "God bless you," when his staff took it out. And in a press conference, Tony Blair was speaking, and his media advisor, Alistair Campbell, interjected quite famously saying, "We don't do God." More or less publicly saying the Prime Minister is not going to do that ever again, don't worry. And there you see that it's still President Barack Obama ends his speeches with the very same words, "And may God bless the United States of America." Now, I'm enough of a theologian, I'm a confessing Protestant theologian, that I do not read an explicit confession of the Christian faith being made on behalf of all or even most Americans by means of that. What I do see is public religion that is still having to make an essentially theological argument in order to identify who this president is by his public statement and who he and we believe the American people are. So America is still, even though it is pluralistic and increasingly it is becoming secularized, it is deeply theological, except where it's not. And that's where I would simply cite the work of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. I think the very best work on secularization you can get a hold of these days. And I think Taylor's exactly right, that we have in the West, we have progressed through three different sets of conditions of belief. And the first set of conditions of belief was that it was impossible not to believe. For most of Western history, most of human history, of course, but even in the West, it has been impossible not to be a theist until fairly recently. And in my book on Atheism Remix, one of the interesting things, I had a thought one night as I'm writing this book, where did the word come from? And thankfully, the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, will tell you. And so I spent a couple hours reading through all the material on atheism in the Oxford English Dictionary, and the word was coined by Miles Coverdale, a Bible translator during the time of the Tudors, of Elizabeth I. And he didn't coin it because he was talking about Richard Dawkins. He coined it because he had to come up with something to explain the idea that someone might not believe in God, but he didn't know anyone. There were heretics in the era, but there were no atheists. And it was impossible. There was no other worldview that gave an explanation for the world as it is and as it is experienced. The second set of conditions, Taylor says, is possible not to believe. And this is the advent of modernity, the Enlightenment, alternative worldviews. And this is where Dawkins comes in, where he very honestly says that Darwinism made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, which implies that before Darwin it was impossible. You had to have an explanation, a naturalistic explanation. And modernity, in its early stage, opened the door, and at its height in the middle of the 20th century made this possible. But Charles Taylor says there's a third set of intellectual conditions, and that is impossible to believe. In other words, that which makes theism possible has evaporated in some social space. And this is where Charles Taylor says, this is amongst the elites. And Charles Taylor says, quite honestly, amongst the intellectual elites in Europe and in the United States, it is increasingly the case that this third set of intellectual conditions applies, such that it is virtually impossible for many people in those intellectual elites to believe that theism is plausible. Now, that means that some massive shift is taking place, and I recognize I'm speaking mostly in terms of the present and the past, but I intend to further my claim and say that so long as there is statecraft, and so long as there is a nation in the United States of America, and so long as there is any continuity with who we are as a people and with this constitutional experiment, our statecraft will continue to be inherently theological. Again, President Obama last week at the prayer breakfast said this: "We believe that each of us is wonderfully made," and the President's remarks that's put in quotations, clear reference to the Psalms, "in the image of God, and we therefore believe in the inherent dignity of every human being, a dignity that no earthly power can take away, and central to that dignity is religious freedom." And the great theological achievement of the 20th century was the raising of religious liberty in terms of statecraft, the great theological achievement, as a major foreign policy aim of the United States. Very quickly, Christian realism. I raise in the address title, Moral Man and Immoral Foreign Policy. And I mean to hearken back to Reinhold Niebuhr in order to say that a theological read of American statecraft for the last 7 or 8 decades demonstrates, I would argue, that even though there are political discontinuities, there are strategic discontinuities, the continuity is a basic form of realism in terms of foreign policy that is bipartisan and continuing. And I would argue that that realism is actually Christian realism. It's not to say that it's sectarian in terms of its Christian realism. It's not to say that it's deeply theological in terms of any specific theological structure. It is to say that theology is that essential component and ingredient of that realism, without which I don't believe it becomes a stable experiment. And again, I go back to Reinhold Niebuhr. It was his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, written in 1932, that helped to shape the debate. He'd been very much a part of public debate before. Christian realism really emerged in response to the German war aims. But it was also tied to Reinhold Niebuhr's understanding of intractable human problems, including poverty. And so with the labor movement and all the things emerging, and with the basic maldistribution of resources and social injustices, Christian realism emerged in a neo-orthodox theological frame as a way of understanding how one could affirm once again human sinfulness. And so it became as a theological anthropology operationally as much as anything else. By the way, the title of his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, also betrays the basic way that Niebuhr tried to make this argument. He really seemed to understand the Augustinian insight that sin is the sole and sufficient explanation for why human beings act as they act. But he's really a neo-Augustinian. And that's reflected in that title, because think about it, it's Moral Man and Immoral Society. So in other words, the human being left to himself, he really didn't adopt an Augustinian understanding of the individual. It's when you put the individual in community, and you put human beings together, it's the social structures that allow for and facilitate the immorality that takes place. And so this basically changed the terms of the debate. And there's a basic Manichaean worldview that still comes through. And one of the interesting things, an interesting story that someone ought to write a doctoral dissertation about, hint, is the relationship between Reinhold Niebuhr and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That would be a tremendous insight into one of the most critical eras of the 20th century. And Bonhoeffer's experience and the experience of others in terms of Nazi-occupied Europe, and then of course the rise of the Third Reich itself, all this became very clear. And it made the New Orthodox embrace something like the Manichaeanism that they've been trying to get rid of for the better part of 100 years. And so we're back to, in 1944, Reinhold Niebuhr's book, The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. Hard to get more Manichaean than that. But the other thing I want to bring in from Reinhold Niebuhr is his understanding of irony. Niebuhr gave a superstructure to so many of those who were actively involved in statecraft. And furthermore, he helped the elites and the middlebrow culture to come to an understanding that the human sinfulness was an inescapable and an absolutely essential affirmation in order to understand the world as it was experienced. And this also means the use of power, because the big issue, of course, the abandonment of pacifism was the use of power. And Reinhold Niebuhr said in a fallen world, power has to be checked by power, and occasionally massive, horrifying uses of power. But to that must be added his understanding of irony. And in this, he's deeply Augustinian. And by the way, there's so many Christians who fail to understand just how important irony is to the Christian faith. Those of you who will look to the New Testament, read the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is drenched in irony. Irony is used by John in order to make very clear his message. There's a basic irony in the fallen human experience, isn't there? I mean, that's Reinhold Niebuhr's point. What we try to do at our very best, we often fail to accomplish our aims, but we have to do it anyway. The irony is that every human attempt to do good involves, by some measure, doing evil. Every attempt to help involves a risk of doing harm. But inaction is the least excusable position of all. And the irony is that we're sometimes not even sure why we do what we do. And that's a deeply Christian understanding. We're not even sure. This just gets to where I teach moral theory. I talk about the Boy Scout, because I was a Boy Scout. And there's a proverbial Boy Scout saves the little old lady who's walking across the street, grabs her as a bus is hauling down on her. And he's rightly honored for that. But why did he do it? Well, we don't even know why he did it. And if you're the little old lady, proverbially in the story, you don't care why he did it. You're very glad that he did it. And the Christian worldview, points us back in terms of an Augustinian or Pauline New Testament understanding or Genesis 3 understanding of humanity. The fact we're not even sure why he did it. Did he do it thinking he'd be praised for it? Did he do it for reasons he doesn't even understand? Did he do it out of a sense of duty? Who knows why he did it? He probably doesn't know why he did it, but I'm glad he did it. Those are ironic insights into human nature. And Reinhold Niebuhr really helped us to understand this. And for instance, in his book, The Irony of American History, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote, there are many obviously ironic elements in current history. And he says, particularly our own national history. And this is very interesting. He says, because a nation that who has risen so recently to power and from innocency to responsibility. And so he says, America is just in the middle of the 20th century. All of a sudden gone from weakness to power, from innocency to responsibility. And he says it's been nonetheless transmuted. He said it's such that even our harmless stumbling in the world is not always so harmless anymore. We have to take responsibility as a nation. So we have to take responsibility to do good, he says. But he says we shouldn't be surprised that American history, and we might say now American statecraft, is filled with what he says, rather ironic incongruities. This Christian realism means no utopianism. It means there's no final peace. It requires an eschatology that can't be brought about by statecraft. It means, on the other hand, but there's no surrender of the loss of hope. It means we are to do good, even when we admittedly clumsily seek to do good. We must seek to be better at doing good. It means that there is no way to fight evil without the use of means that themselves may do harm. Very quickly, there was a fatal flaw in Christian realism, at least in Reinhold Niebuhr's Christian realism, and that was it was actually insufficiently Christian as it was picked up in the larger society. And because of that, it became realism without the Christian part. George Marsden, in his new book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, that just came out, says that the grand irony of the strategy, means Niebuhr's strategy, was that while Niebuhr himself used it effectively as in person in his public role for the Christian heritage, its subjective qualities made the faith wholly optional and dispensable, end quote. So in other words, he had reduced the theological content so much of Christian realism that the Christian part dropped out. Realism is what remained. And the problem here is that Christian realism, when it drops its explicitly Christian content, really has no sufficient argument for human rights and human dignity, and no sufficient rationale for understanding how to deal with the challenges on the world scene. Very quickly, in conclusion, an admission. A claim and an acknowledgement, now an admission. I feel like I need to say that evangelicals and other conservative Christians have not consistently heeded the advice of Augustine or even of Niebuhr. And we have too quickly picked up on an American triumphalism that should be chastened by the Christian realism of not only Niebuhr but of Augustine. And so what you have right now taking place amongst American evangelicals, at least those who are actively engaged in trying to think of the intersection of theology and public life, is how on the other side of that triumphalism, which now is quite frankly rather embarrassing, is to see how in the world should a proper mode of political engagement and of the intersection of theology and public life be constructed in ways that really makes us even more true to what we believe and more consistent with the Christian worldview. I want to end after that admission with a concern, and that is this. I am concerned that world history, not just the history of the United States and its statecraft, but world history demonstrates that without an explicitly theological argument, there is no sufficient grounding for human rights and human dignity. And that's why I think even those who try to make the argument in secular terms end up being profoundly unsecular in making their arguments. I think I know why they're profoundly unsecular, and I think it's because when you talk about human dignity and human rights, when you talk about anthropology, you're actually talking theology. When you talk about human rights and human dignity, these have to be grounded in something greater than a mere anthropology. But I think that's where there could be much fruitful discourse and discussion. And I think that's why my claim, my acknowledgement, my admission, and my concern all fit together. And I leave it to your good thinking. Thank you so much.